The recent jewellery heist at the Louvre in Paris has captured the headlines. But it also begs the question, how safe are the British crown jewels? Every year, over 2 million people visit the crown jewels in the Tower of London. Housed behind bomb-proof glass, watched by over 100 hidden cameras, and guarded by a 22-strong detachment from the British Army, assisted by the famous yeoman warders, no wonder we have in Britain the expression, as safe as the crown jewels. But that hasn't always been the case. Back in 1671, a former army officer, Thomas Blood, made an audacious attempt to steal England's crown jewels, and he almost got away with it too. Brought in front of the king himself, his punishment was, well, not as you might expect. So this is the story of Colonel Blood, and the only time the crown jewels have ever been stolen from the Tower of London. Thomas Blood was born into a reasonably prosperous Protestant family in County Clare, Ireland, in 1618. When civil war broke out between the King and Parliament in England in 1642, Blood sailed across the Irish Sea and enlisted in the Royalist army. And whilst he would later style himself Colonel Blood, he was no more of a colonel than Tom Parker or Colonel Sanders, although, unlike those gentlemen, there is definite evidence that he was an officer. It might be that he was a captain in the Royalist army, records are unsure, before switching sides in 1648 and definitely holding the rank of lieutenant in the Parliamentary army back in Ireland. And there in Ireland, he was soon assigned to the Commission of Peace, a body of spies responsible for subverting the Royalist cause. And it seems that this clandestine nature of this work, with its duplicity, disguises and ability to disappear at convenient times, was right up his street. So much so that in 1653 Oliver Cromwell rewarded him with gifts of land in Ireland and also made him a Justice of the Peace. However, with the death of Cromwell and then the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, his fortunes took a dramatic turn for the worse. The 1662 Act of Settlement sought to cancel or annul some of the land grants dished out by Cromwell, and that left Blood in financial ruin. He now plotted with other disgruntled parliamentarian supporters to seize Dublin Castle and hold the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, James Butler, the Duke of Ormond, to ransom. The plotters were apprehended and several were executed, but Blood managed to flee to the Netherlands with a price on his head. There, legend has it, that Blood swore revenge on the Duke. And incredibly, despite being a wanted man, he returned to England in 1670, where, adopting the alias of Alof, he practised as a doctor in Romford, just to the east of London. Seeing as he wasn't qualified to be a doctor, this must have taken his skills of subterfuge to a new level. Later that year, he made another attempt to abduct the Duke of Ormond, this time as he was travelling along St James's Street in London itself. Seizing the aristocrat, his accomplices bound him to a horse and galloped along Piccadilly towards Tyburn, where they planned to hang him in public. Ormond was rescued by a servant who gave chase, but once again Blood evaded capture. We will never know his precise motives for his next audacious venture. A strike against the monarchy, compensation for his lost estates in Ireland, or simply because it was a challenge. But he now turned his sights on stealing England's crown jewels. The crown jewels are effectively priceless parts of Britain's heritage, housed in the Tower of London. Back in 1671, they were almost entirely brand new. When Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarians had executed King Charles I in 1649, the medieval and Tudor crown jewels of England, and I do mean England, as Scotland was a separate country at this time, were melted down. So when the executed Charles's son was restored to the throne in 1660 as King Charles II, a whole new set of jewels was commissioned for his coronation. Nowadays, almost priceless in their own right, the gold and precious stones are valued at anywhere between £3 and £5 billion. That's about 4 to 7 billion US dollars. They're kept in the Jewel House in the Tower of London, behind bomb-proof glass and watched by over 100 hidden cameras. A 22-strong Tower Guard detachment of the British Army is dedicated to their protection, assisted by the yeoman warders, who are all ex-military personnel. No wonder that level of security has given rise to the phrase, as safe as the crown jewels. But back in 1671, things were, how can I say, a little bit more lax. Whilst the tower did have guards, the only man specifically keeping his eyes on the crown jewels was their 77-year-old keeper, Talbot Edwards, who lived in an apartment above them. And rather than all the modern security, they were simply kept in the basement of the Martin Tower behind a metal grille. And even less like today, for a small fee, Mr. Edwards would personally take visitors to the basement for a private guided tour. And so it was that in early 1671, Blood, posing as a parson or priest, Dr. Aloff, went to see the crown jewels. Chatting away to Talbot Edwards, he paid him for a private tour. The charming Irish clergyman returned at a later date with his wife, or at least a female pretending to be his wife. But during this particular visit, the parson's wife had a violent stomachache. She was taken to Edwards' apartment upstairs, where she was tended to by Mrs. Edwards. A few days later, a thankful Parson Aloff appeared with a present, 4 pairs of white gloves, as a thank you for Mrs. Edwards' kindness. What a nice man. The parson and his wife now became friends of the Edwards family, visiting on a regular basis. And it was at this stage that Blood now suggested that his wealthy and fictitious nephew meet Edwards' daughter as a possible suitor. I bet Talbot Edwards couldn't believe his good fortune, but it was all about to blow up in his face. At around 7 a.m. on the 9th of May 1671, the parson arrived at the Tower of London along with his nephew, who was actually his son, Thomas Jr., a highwayman who went by the alias of Thomas Hunt. Accompanying them were 3 of the so-called suitors' so-called friends. Whilst one stayed with the horses, the rest of the party entered the treasure keeper's apartment, where an excited Mrs. Edwards was preparing a meal for them all. As the meal wasn't quite ready, Parson Aloff, that's our man Thomas Blood, suggested that Edwards show them the crown jewels. Mr. Edwards was more than happy to do so and went to fetch the keys. Any idea what might happen next? He took Blood, his son, aka the nephew, and one of the friends, a certain Captain Robert Perrott, down to the basement, while another friend, Richard Halliwell, positioned himself at the top of the stairs as a lookout. As the elderly Edwards opened the door and led the men into the vault, Blood promptly hit him on the head with a mallet and stabbed him in the stomach with his sword. They then gagged him. Quickly removing the grille, the men grabbed the crown jewels. They seized the state crown, which Charles had commissioned for his coronation to replace Henry VIII's crown, and then used the mallet to attempt to flatten it so it could fit inside one of their cloaks. Next came the orb. Again, made for Charles's recent coronation, the orb was, and still is, a gold sphere weighing just over 2 pounds, 1.2 kilograms, studded with 375 pearls, 365 diamonds, and other precious stones. Blood now shoved that down his breeches, because, well, that wouldn't draw any attention, would it? Finally, they grabbed one of the 2 sceptres. Now, by this stage, you're probably thinking that one of those might also go down his breeches, but as it was too long, his son tried to saw it in half instead. If this heist is somewhere between the most audacious robbery ever and something out of a comedy film, it gets even better. Talbot Edwards' son, Wythe, was serving in the army. In fact, he'd been fighting in Flanders, modern-day Belgium. Wythe Edwards now chose this particular moment, of all moments, to visit Ma and Pa at the Tower of London. Seeing the door to the basement open, he approached. And things now happened in a blur. Robert Halliwell shouted a warning, and at that moment Talbot Edwards came to, and somehow, pulling off his gag, started to shout, "Murder! Treason!" As his son upstairs tried to compute what on earth was going on, Blood and his gang suddenly raced past him, dropping the sceptre in the process. They now ran through the tower with Wythe Edwards in pursuit, shouting an alarm. And as they fled, the gang fired on the wardens who were joining in the chase, wounding one of them. As they turned and ran along Tower Wharf by the River Thames towards the Iron Street, also called St Catherine's Gate, at the eastern side of the tower, Captain Martin Beckman, head of the day's watch, joined the chase. Almost at that final gate, Blood attempted unsuccessfully to shoot another guard to escape, before finally being overpowered by Beckman. Robert Perrott was also apprehended, but the rest of the gang managed to mount their horses and galloped out of the Tower of London. However, as he galloped clear, Thomas Hunt, that's Blood Jr., the highwayman, rode straight into a pole of a cart and was unseated. The other two men, however, managed to escape. Back at the tower, the slightly out of breath Thomas Blood merrily told Beckman, "It was a gallant attempt, but it was for a crown." He then boldly announced that he would answer to nobody but the king himself. And thus it was that Colonel Thomas Blood appeared in front of King Charles II, along with his brother, the Duke of York, and his cousin, Prince Rupert. King Charles demanded, "What if I should give you your life?" To which Blood replied, "I would endeavour to deserve it, sire." What happened next has never fully been explained. Some say Charles feared some sort of Republican rising by Blood's supporters. Others claim that he was a government spy, a double agent, which would explain why he was able to operate as a doctor so openly in London. Maybe the private audience demanded by Blood and granted by the king was to keep certain secrets out of open court. Or maybe Charles just liked Blood's sheer audacity and saw in him a fellow rogue and kindred spirit. Whatever the reason, Blood received a full pardon for his crimes. Moreover, the king also gave him lands in Ireland, with a rental income of £500 a year, which is about £100,000 in today's money. Both his son, Thomas Hunt, and Perrott were released without charge. For the next 10 years, Colonel Thomas Blood became a familiar figure around London and made frequent appearances at court. Whilst his highwayman's son would actually die before him, another one of his sons would go on to join the army and commanded the Duke of Marlborough's artillery at the Battle of Blenheim. Old Talbot Edwards recovered from his injuries, and for the next 3 years he continued to give visitors guided tours of the Crown Jewels for a price, but now also regaled his visitors with stories of Colonel Blood's attempted heist. He died in 1674, aged 80, and is buried actually in the chapel inside the Tower of London. Colonel Thomas Blood's luck finally ran out in 1679. He made insulting remarks about his former patron, the Duke of Buckingham, who successfully sued him for £10,000. But even then, it was the Irishman who had the last laugh. A year later, he died in August 1680, aged 62, having not paid the Duke a single penny. Blood was buried in the churchyard at St Margaret's Church, now Christchurch Gardens, near St James's Park. Such was his reputation as a master of deception that his body was actually exhumed by the authorities for confirmation, as it was rumoured that he'd faked his own death to avoid paying that fine due to the Duke of Buckingham. Every year, over 2 million people view the Crown Jewels under much tighter security than in 1671. And to this date, Thomas Blood remains the only man to have ever stolen the Crown Jewels from the Tower of London. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story from British history, and there's lots more in the pipeline. But in the meantime, you might also enjoy this one. Thanks for joining me today, and until next time, keep well and keep exploring the incredible story that is British history.